nation's most impressive Easter demonstration. 75,000 massed before Lincoln Memorial to hear Marian Anderson, colored contralto, make her capital debut at the great Emancipator Shrine. Refusal of the DAR to let her use their hall fanned a countrywide controversy, with this great gathering as the climax. The singer was invited by Secretary of the Interior, Ickes, who attends with Secretary of the Treasury, Morgenthau. Spectators include Supreme Court Justice Black, New York Senator Robert Wagner, and a host of notables, here to listen to the voice acclaimed by many as the finest in a century.
Thank you so much for joining us. My name is J. Paul Nicholas. I'm an associate artist here at FST. And welcome to our first forum of 2021. First panel discussion. Yay! Not only are we back to live theater, but we're back to doing our wonderful forums, which help us all to develop a deeper understanding of the plays that we do here and the issues that they raise for us. I'd like to introduce someone who you may already know, someone who, as they say, needs no introduction. And he will be our moderator for the evening. And once he's up here, he will introduce our special guest. This gentleman, even though he was born in North Carolina, he was raised in St. Petersburg, so we accept him as a local. He studied at Howard University and University of Florida College of Law. He has served on and serves on so many committees I don't have time to name them all, but I'll tell you two of them. One of them is our board. He's a member of the FST board. He's also the chairman of our forums committee, and he hosts a lot of these events for us. He also, bet you didn't know this, writes, directs, and produces his own documentary films, and a couple of them have won awards. So he knows of what he speaks. He's also very involved with youth, getting youth to come to FST and to do all kinds of wonderful things. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Charles Williams.
Okay, thank you all. You're in for a real treat, so I want to get sort of right to it. But just as a show of hands, so I'll have a context, how many of you have seen the play? Great, perfect. So we're going to have a forum that's going to basically discuss Marian Anderson, and there's no better person to do this in terms of a Q&A and a discussion than my guest. Dr. Ray Arsenault is the Emeritus John Hope Franklin Professor of Southern History at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg. He received his undergraduate degree at Princeton and his PhD at Brandeis University. He is a specialist in the political, social, and environmental history of the American South. He is the author of numerous books, treatises, and articles, including the book in which this talk is centered around, The Sound of Freedom, Marian Anderson, the Lincoln Memorial, and the Concert That Awakened America. His book, Freedom Riders, 1961 and the Struggle for Racial Justice, was the basis of the acclaimed PBS series of the same name. And his most recent book, Arthur Ashe, A Life, is a definitive biography of tennis legend and social activist Arthur Ashe. And he is working on a biography of John Lewis, which will also be a PBS series. So welcome my first guest, my only guest, actually. I've been watching too many talk shows, Dr. Ray Arsenault. Now, I will slip back and forth and call him Ray because I actually know him. I grew up in St. Petersburg. He's an icon in St. Petersburg. So if I don't call you Doctor, please forgive me. And this is the book, The Sound of Freedom, Marian Anderson, the Lincoln Memorial, and the Concert That Awakened America. So I'm going to introduce this session by reading what you state about Marian Anderson early in the book. You tell us that Marian Anderson was a symbol of resolute courage and human dignity. Her story is one of struggle against self-doubt, racial prejudice, and numerous obstacles that would have vanquished a person of lesser resolve. So let's begin there. What about her led you to write such an introduction? And if you pull the mic up.
Yeah, well, by the way, I'm pleased to be here. I'm, like a lot of people during COVID, I've sort of been hiding, although I've been doing a lot of Zoom lectures, so it's nice to see flesh and blood human beings in front of me. One thing that I have been doing, I was doing the interviews for a PBS American Masters documentary, 2 hours, which will be on next year. Rita Colburn is the director, and she won an Emmy 5 years ago for her documentary on Maya Angelou. So I think it's going to be quite wonderful. But that caused me to kind of rethink how did I get here, since I really had no personal background in classical music, except that my grandmother, whom I lived with part of the time growing up, was a classical pianist trained at the New England Conservatory, and she loved Marian Anderson, and I remember as a boy not liking it. Actually, I would get her confused, first of all, with other singers, and just what as an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, it wasn't my cup of tea. So it's kind of ironic that I wish my grandmother died in 1971. I wish she was still around, that I finally came around and wrote this book on Marian Anderson. But I don't know. It's always intrigued me, the concert. But her entire life, I can't say that I knew the details of her life before I researched this book. And it really began as I wanted to contribute something to the Lincoln bicentennial in 2009. I was teaching at the University of Chicago that year, and I thought, well, I've always been fascinated with Carl Sandburg. I was born on his 70th birthday, so I was identified with Carl Sandburg, and thought I would do a book on Carl Sandburg's Lincoln, as you may know, one of the most popular studies of Lincoln ever written. And I bought all 6 volumes in one of Powell's bookstore there in Hyde Park in Chicago, but it didn't take me long to realize that, I have many friends who spent their entire careers and lives studying Abraham Lincoln. You just don't jump in, I think, and think that you can really make a substantial contribution. I'm essentially a 20th century historian, and I realized that the book I really wanted to write, and maybe could write, make a contribution, was focusing on the Lincoln Memorial and on Marian Anderson's concert and her contribution to the civil rights story. But I had limited time. The bicentennial, it comes and it goes, and I really didn't think I had time to do the book, and I felt pressured. And in fact, I had an advance on royalties. I accepted money from the press and was committed to doing it. And I thought, I don't know if I can do it. So I took a long walk on the Fort DeSoto beach one afternoon, and I can remember the moment when I thought, if Marian Anderson could do what she did in her lifetime to overcome those obstacles, then I can suck it up and do this book. The challenge I'm facing is nothing compared to what she faced through her entire life. So that's how I came to write it, and we were able to have a recreation of the concert on the 70th anniversary at the Lincoln Memorial. We had about 25,000 people there. She actually had 75,000 at the original concert in 1939. But we had we had the Chicago Children's Choir and Sweet Honey in the Rock, the great black a cappella group, and Colin Powell was swearing in some new citizens and orating with the Gettysburg Address, and we had the Air Force Band, and it was just an amazing scene that Easter morning in 2009. So we were able to make it one of the major events of the Lincoln Bicentennial.
Now, prior to the bicentennial, obviously, Marian Anderson becomes this world-renowned vocalist. And she was born in Philadelphia on February 27th, 1897. So I guess the question begs, how does a little black girl growing up in a segregated Philadelphia becomes one of the most renowned contraltos in the world? What was her journey like?
Well, it's an utterly amazing story, I would argue, that she had no business thinking she could ever do what she did. No one else had ever done it. Sometimes we refer to her as the Jackie Robinson of classical music, and she really was that. There had been great African-American musicians in jazz and blues and popular music, ragtime. And there were a few who had sort of cracked the barrier a little bit in classical music, but no one to the extent that she did. And she grew up in essentially church music in Philadelphia. She was known as the baby contralto. In fact, once when she was about to sing at the Academy of Music, I was just there last week actually, staying in the hotel right across, and it was just really moving for me. She saw this flyer in the street. It said, "Come hear the baby contralto." You know, she was 8 years old. So they recognized her gift, but as I'm sure many of you know, classical music is not something that you just do. It takes a lifetime of preparation and practice and diligence. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why the racial stereotype in America and in Europe as well was that blacks could not do classical music because they might have natural rhythm, right? They could dance, they could sing, they could do kind of natural things, but they didn't have the intelligence or the discipline to do classical music, which of course was absurd, but that was the conventional wisdom. That's what she had to face. So trying to even get a voice teacher to take her on in Philadelphia was extremely difficult. One of her real first, I think, embittering experiences was that she grew up in a neighborhood that was multi-ethnic. Philadelphia had a very large black population for a northern city in those days, and in fact, W.E.B. Du Bois, the great black sociologist, did his first study of that neighborhood in Black Philadelphia, which came out actually the year she was born. But she had to find a voice teacher, and she just went to the best known singing school, and she's in line trying to register, and of course everybody else gets registered, and she's still sitting there. And then she goes up finally, and the clerk says, "Well, we don't take Negroes here." And she was stunned, and several times during her life, I think she almost gave up. Although she had this incredible inner strength, I would argue that kept her going, because it was again, she was trying to do something that no African American woman certainly had ever done. I mean, she went on these concert tours that were just back-breaking, certainly voice-breaking. She would do twice as many concerts as any other artist in the United States, and some of it in the South, fighting Jim Crow segregation, and she never knew when some kind of racial incident would be just around the corner. She never really ate in the hotel dining rooms, even if she was allowed to stay in the hotels, because she thought there might be some incident. So she would eat in her room. She usually went up the freight elevator, not the regular elevator. And this was even after she became world famous. But of course, like a lot of black performers in the early 20th century, she had to go to Europe to get a lot of her training, and also to, well, she became famous there long before she was famous in the United States. And she was arguably, by the mid-1930s, one of the 2 or 3 most famous singers in the world. But people back home, really didn't have much of a sense of her. I mean, 1935, she sang at, she actually wasn't part of the Salzburg Festival because the Austrian Nazis wouldn't let her. But they worked out a deal where she would perform unofficially. She couldn't be on the program. She performed in this fairly small venue called the Mozarteum, and just so happened that probably the greatest musical figure in the world, Toscanini, was in the audience. And he'd heard about this young black woman who had a 3-octave range and could sing like no one else, but he didn't believe it until he heard her. And he comes, of course, in the intermission, he comes back into I guess it was equivalent to the green room or whatever, and he utters the statement which followed her for the rest of her life, which that he said, "This is a voice that you hear only once in 100 years." And her new agent, Saul Hurok, of course, who was famous for developing Anna Pavlova and the Bolshoi Ballet and many other acts, he heard what Toscanini said, and he said, "We're off and running." And then, so in late 1935, he brought her back to the United States and played up what he called the kind of Marian Anderson fairy tale. She was just folks, just the same natural girl who grew up in Philadelphia. She was not a diva. That was the point, that unlike many of the other great singers, she never sort of played that role of the diva. She was always just as warm and natural and friendly to everyone, even though she had this extraordinary presence on the stage. Never opened her eyes. She always closed her eyes when she sang. Sort of ethereal voice. Again, you could recognize it from any other voice, but she went through that European period in the 30s in Germany, in England, particularly in Scandinavia. She was just an incredible hit. Scandinavia, where of course they'd hardly ever seen a black skin at that point.
Yeah, and on that note, in your book you tell us about a review of one of her performances in Oslo, and the reviewer writes that Anderson was, quote, "dressed in electric blue satin and looking very much like a chocolate bar." And that was the review. So she makes her way, she becomes really a sensation in Europe, and she makes her way back to the United States. Why do you think the reception in Europe was so much greater for her than it was in the United States?
Well, part of it was that she was exotic, certainly in Scandinavia, but all over Europe, in part because she sang German lieder, Schubert, things like that, but also, antebellum slave spirituals. And she always insisted on mixing her programs, that she would have the spirituals, but she'd also have the Schubert. In fact, when she first performed at the White House in 1936, that's when she befriended Eleanor Roosevelt, and FDR was always trying to humor Eleanor by, she always wanted to bring in these acts, and of course she had a great social conscience and wanted to make the acts more diverse, and so I think at one point Roosevelt said, is this more of that long hair music, as it was called? But they basically insisted that they requested that Marian Anderson only sing spirituals, and she said no. She said no to the President of the United States. She said, no, I will choose my program. And so even though she was in some ways an introverted person and not a showy person, which later factors into her role as a kind of reluctant civil rights hero. But there was this inner strength. She knew who she was. I think she had a great kind of nurturing family. Her mother, who was scrubbing floors at Wanamaker's department store. Her father died when she was young and left them kind of destitute, but they had a real grounding, I think, in the church in Philadelphia. And she had lots of cousins, and just somehow she was able to develop this sense of self that she could turn the President of the United States down, even though after her father died, she had to drop out of school. She didn't graduate from high school until she was 24. A lot of people didn't realize that because she always looked so young compared to what she really was. I mean, she died in 1993. She was 96 years old. Even then, you would have guessed she was in her 70s. WETA did a documentary on her just 2 years before she died, and you just can't believe that this woman is 94 years old, as just as articulate and as almost youthful in a way. And she also had the advantage that she was very attractive. She's very tall, almost 5'10", and she had high cheekbones, and she was one of the first African American women who, in American popular culture, was actually mentioned in the press as being attractive. That was really not done. She and Lena Horne really were the first two. And she also, although she came from poverty, but she developed a great affection for Parisian gowns, and she was so tall and elegant and slender, and I mean, she just looked like something from another world. There are many stories about her performing particularly in places like Texas and Houston and Dallas, which were strictly segregated, and yet these people would come to hear her sing, and it was like the whole segregation system just broke down. I mean, whites and blacks joining together, just trying to to touch her, trying to get close to her. And a lot of the music critics would say, I've never seen anything like this. The whole Jim Crow system just sort of collapsed in front of us, and of course it was set back up, but she provided these moments of a kind of vision of an alternative America, when someone just out of the greatness of her voice could transmit people, to another place.
Let's set up the Lincoln Memorial concert, and let me say this. At one point I thought the issue of her at Constitution Hall was integrating Constitution Hall. But really it seems like the issue was whether or not blacks would be allowed at all to perform and to sit in Constitution Hall. So let's lay the groundwork in terms of how this concert started, and what the role the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, and Constitution Hall played in it.
Yeah, it's a fairly complicated story. Howard University, your alma mater, had in Washington at least, kind of a famous concert series. And Charles Cohen ran it, and Marian Anderson had sung before in Washington, but before she became really world famous. And so, if they had a hall that seated 500 or 800, it'd be all right. But in other parts of the country, by the late 30s, she was drawing 10,000 people and more. But Washington was the only large city in the United States without a municipal concert hall. The only place that had it 2,000 seats or more was the Daughters of the American Revolution, Constitution Hall, and they had instituted a color ban going back to 1931. There've been several incidents of black performers, so they instituted this policy: no more black performers. Blacks could come in the audience, but they couldn't perform on the stage. National Theater, just a few blocks away, just the opposite. You could perform as an African American on stage, but no blacks were allowed in the audience. And this was sort of typical of Washington's kind of crazy quilt patchwork of segregation and integration. You never knew it wasn't like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, where it was, really a completely kind of hermetically sealed system where you knew what you were up against. And in Washington, one thing could be segregated and another would not. And so the Howard people thought that since Marian Anderson was so extraordinarily famous at this point, that all the rules would be set aside. They thought, well, this is Marian Anderson. This isn't just a normal performer. He's the most famous singer in the world at this point. But somehow, of course, the DAR didn't get the memo that she had become that famous. And so it's an Easter concert. And his only choice really at that point was to go to Constitution Hall. And of course, they turn him away, and they claim, oh, it's already booked. It's already booked. I'm sorry. Pick another date. And so what he did actually is he got a white friend to apply for the Easter date. And of course, sure, it was wide open. They'd been lying to him, and he pointed that out, but it didn't really shake them. There was a man named Fred Hand, who was the manager of Constitution Hall, and he was a pretty militant white supremacist. He was a big part of the problem, although the national board of DAR wasn't very much better, really. So they're trying desperately to get her into Constitution Hall in early 1939, and when it doesn't look like they're going to do it, then they go to the school board, and there was an auditorium in the largest white high school, which I think held about 1,500, and of course this is seen as when they apply to use that auditorium as a surreptitious way to break down segregated schools, and so they're turned down by the school system. And they really, as Easter is approaching, they don't really have anywhere inside, at least, for her to sing. And at this point, Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, steps into the situation. I mean, she had invited her to sing back in 1936, and they befriended each other. And Eleanor Roosevelt was a member of the DAR, but she only joined the DAR in 1933 because so she, as First Lady, could. They'd always have their annual meetings, like a convention in Washington, and then they would always have a reception at the White House. But she really had very little interest, I would say, in the DAR. And in the 30s, the DAR became increasingly reactionary and right-wing, very much opposed to the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt, and allied with the Liberty League, which was an organization in the 1930s which was leading this sort of right-wing attack on the Democratic administration. So in February, late February of 1939, now Eleanor Roosevelt wrote a daily column, and in this one column she resigns from the DAR, and she says why. And I mean, no First Lady had ever done anything like this, intruded into kind of the political, waters, and it just caused a sensation. And it turned this issue of where is Marian Anderson going to sing into a national, even international issue. All of a sudden there were Marian Anderson support committees, and labor unions were involved, and orchestras all over the country taking votes in her support. But still, they still didn't have a place for her to sing. The DAR dug in its heels because they thought they were being pressured, and ironically, it was most of the northern members who took the lead. You would have thought it would be the southern members, Alabama, Mississippi, but it was actually the President General was from New York, and which is important because the ultimate meaning of her concert is going to be that it's in Washington, D.C. It's in the nation's capital. It's not Birmingham, Alabama. It's not Jackson, Mississippi. It's in the nation's capital where she was prevented from singing. A woman who had sung to the crowned heads of Europe, but couldn't sing in her own nation's capital. And of course, at this time, we were trying to distinguish ourselves from the totalitarian regimes in Europe. That we were kind of rediscovering our democratic ethos and trying to point out we were not like Germany or not like Italy or not like Spain. And yet here, they're turning Marian Anderson away.
And just as a point of reference, this is before Brown versus Board of Education, so this is legal segregation.
Oh, it's absolutely, yeah, sure. Yeah, this is 15 years.
And what was the DAR's rationale? It was just the law, we couldn't do it if we wanted to, or what was their rationale?
They kept changing the rationale. I think it was they just didn't want to be dictated to. That's what they said. So the more people tried to pressure them to open up Constitution Hall, the more they resisted. And over time, I mean, the DAR eventually comes around many, many years later. In fact, when the postage stamp is issued, I think in 2005, with Marian Anderson on it, they hold the ceremony in Constitution Hall. And when we had the recreation in 2009, at the very last minute, the DAR sponsored a reception for us. And they flew in, I think they had nationally, it's a very large organization, 2 black members. They flew them in sort of as a showpiece. And of course, the Chicago Children's Choir is almost all black, and they were in there. It was an amazing scene, I have to tell you. And the woman who played, who sang the concert, essentially recreated the concert, was the great soprano Denise Graves, who had known Marian Anderson. Marian Anderson had sponsored her and had given her one of her Parisian gowns. And so she planned to wear the gown, and she had it dry cleaned, and it started to fall apart. And so when she came out that morning, Easter morning, to sing, before she started singing, she told this story, and she brought out the seamstress who saved the day. She had a friend who was, I guess, a really skilled seamstress, and she spent like 2 or 3 days around the clock saving this dress. And it was quite something. Of course, Denise Graves is a very, very beautiful woman, and I'm sure she could have had a croaker sack on and people wouldn't have complained. So she brings out the seamstress to a standing ovation, and all of that. But just on another note, we were doing a lot of media interviews on radio before the concert, and so I'm in one city and Denise Graves is in another, and I'm listening and participating in the conversation, and excuse me, the radio guy says, "Well, I hear you've been practicing. That you've been practicing for your recreation of Marian Anderson's concert," and she said, "Well, yeah." He said, "But you're a famous soprano. Do you need to practice?" She said, "Well, yeah." She said, "Well, I'm good, but I'm no Marian Anderson." And, it was pretty funny, I thought.
Let's go back to the actual concert, that Easter. Was it actually Easter Sunday?
It was Easter Sunday, April 9th.
And could you just sort of give the people here, you describe it so beautifully in your book, but what stands out to you about that concert?
Well, of course, Marian Anderson herself had almost nothing to do with the planning. She was out on a tour in the West, and she knew that she had been turned away from Constitution Hall, but she was embarrassed by the whole thing, and she didn't really want to push it. So the DAR doesn't want me, I don't want them. But Saul Hurok and Charles Hamilton Houston, the NAACP leader, and Walter White, the head of the NAACP, and Eleanor Roosevelt, and a lot of what was called the Black Cabinet in those years, Mary McLeod Bethune and others, they're determined she's going to sing. And there was a woman on the music faculty at Howard who said, "How about if she sings outside?" And first they thought Lafayette Park, next to the White House, and it's not too far from Constitution Hall either. And then it's not clear exactly. A lot of people claim that they came up with the idea, but why doesn't she sing at the Lincoln Memorial? Now, the memorial had been there since 1922, and there had only been one large gathering. It was I think, a AME Zion church convention with a couple thousand people, but it wasn't the way it is now. Lincoln, in fact, in those years was not really seen as the great emancipator. He was more the person who saved the Union. They did when they dedicated the Lincoln Memorial in 1922. With almost no mention of him as the great emancipator or race or anything like that. And so you think about later with Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream speech in 1963, and all the other gatherings there, it becomes the sacred spot where if you want to make a statement about American democracy, that's where you do it. But the first time it happened was in 1939. It wasn't an obvious choice, but they had to get approval from the Park Service and from the president, and Harold Ickes, who was the most liberal member of FDR's cabinet, Secretary of Interior. Roosevelt's about to go for the Easter weekend, or the Easter break in Warm Springs, where he would go because of his polio. And so Ickes races up to the White House to get him before FDR gets on the train, and he says, can we put Marian Anderson, can she sing at the Lincoln Memorial? And FDR goes, she can sing from the top of the Washington Monument for all I care, if she wants to. So they got permission, but they still didn't know quite what was going to happen. In fact, the night before the concert, Marian tried to back out. She was so nervous that first of all, she was nervous because she'd never performed outside before. And she was afraid her voice just wouldn't sound right. She was accustomed to Carnegie Hall and the greatest venues in the world, and it was really about the quality of the music. It was always about the quality of the music for her. And she was also scared that there might be some incident with the Ku Klux Klan or whatever. And so Saul Hurok sort of talks her off the ledge, and she comes in with her mother on the train, and this big snowstorm hits that morning. And I thought, oh my goodness, all this preparation. They had gotten arranged for Boy Scout troops, black and white, to pass out the programs. They had all these sponsors from the Supreme Court and from Congress and all kinds of celebrities. They did all this preparation, and it looked like it was going to be a disaster. They had no idea how many people were going to show up. They hoped, a couple thousand. Well, in the middle of the day on April 9th, the sun comes out and the snow melts, and it was still a little blustery by the time she sang at 4 o'clock that afternoon, but 75,000 people showed up. About roughly half black and half white, and they were not segregated within the crowd. As you look at the pictures, you'll see it was almost like all the rules were off, and you've probably seen the pictures or maybe heard some of the concert. It was only a half hour long, and she had this mink coat to shelter her from the wind, and she said later, I didn't think anything would come out of my mouth. I didn't think I could sing, but somehow it did, and she began with America. And from then on, she had them. I mean, the crowd was just going crazy. And after the half-hour crowd, you could feel, she said, the crowd surging. They wanted to come up again, to storm the stage, to be near her. Parents were holding up their children so they could see. And I've talked to a lot of people who were there, and it was just one of the magical moments of their life. It was broadcast on NBC radio to millions of people, and it was just a kind of a vision of what America could be. Not really the way America was, because that night after the concert, no hotel in Washington would let Marian Anderson and her mother stay. She had to stay at a senator's house on Pennsylvania Avenue. So she went back to a segregated world, but of course it made her an iconic figure, most famous black woman in the world, and she became the richest African-American woman, and gave away half of her money. I mean, everybody from Leontine Price to Denise Graves really depended on the Marian Anderson scholarships to really start their careers. But it was there's so many testaments of people who were there of just, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. And so in many ways, it's an earlier version of what happens when Jackie Robinson breaks the color line in Major League Baseball in 1947, or the Lewis Schmeling fight, when Joe Louis sort of becomes an American hero, not just a black American hero, but he's standing up against Max Schmeling, or Jesse Owens at the 1936 Olympics. All of those things, I think, establish African Americans as American citizens, but also, particularly with Marian Anderson and what happened to her, the fact that they tried to prohibit her from singing in the nation's capital. I think that's what many people were embarrassed, and I think it pointed out that racism was a stain on the national honor. Mm-hmm. It wasn't something confined to Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama and Florida. It was a problem everywhere. And that's what you needed to get a national civil rights movement. So I've always maintained that this is one of the building blocks to the movement which will emerge after the Brown decision of 1954 with the Montgomery bus boycott and the sit-ins and the freedom rides and all of that. And I think this sort of cracks the mold in a way. And I think that's what cultural things can do. It's not strictly political, but it prepares the ground for this deep political change, I think, which comes in the 1950s and 60s.
All right, and I'm going to open it up to a couple of questions before we end, but she lived to be 96, and before we go to the questions, how did she reflect on what happened? What were her thoughts about looking back as she got older, that concert?
Well, I mean, she had a long history after. I mean, she was 43, when at the concert, and she lives another 53 years, and so there are many things that, because this celebrity is thrust upon her, and because she becomes a civil rights icon, she has a real burden to bear, and she does it. It's not easy. She's not like Paul Robeson, who embraced the role of an agitator or an activist. It was always hard for her, but she broke the color line at the Metropolitan Opera. But in 1955, can you imagine that? It takes 16 years more before the Metropolitan Opera, enlists a black singer. And of course, by that time, she was 58 years old, kind of past her prime, and she did a minor role. And she was one of the first people to desegregate performances in the South, beginning in 1951. In those days, there was a distinction between horizontal and vertical segregation. Some artists, like Marian Anderson, insisted on vertical segregation, which meant you split the hall down the half, right in the middle, and blacks can be on the left and whites can be on the right. But you're not putting blacks in the balcony or farther away, and in any way giving them worse seats. And so she was okay with that. She didn't like it, but the NAACP started to pressure her in 1951. You can't accept any kind of segregation, and she does come around. She's resistant at first. She gets picketed by the NAACP in Richmond, Virginia, of all things. But she becomes a delegate to the United Nations and is involved in all the negotiations with Cameroon, and when the British and the French are leaving Cameroon, and she does all these State Department tours in Asia, and she becomes, along with Louis Armstrong and some of the others, a kind of ambassador, which was a little tricky because she didn't want to misrepresent the problems of race. And since she's a great success, of course, it didn't mean that ordinary African Americans had the same opportunities that she had. And she doesn't retire until 1965, and even then she doesn't retire. She's 68 years old, and then Aaron Copland composes this piece called the Lincoln Portrait, which she does as a spoken part, 13 minutes long, and she had this voice, coming like God's voice itself, and so she would do that all over the country until 1976, and just became the grand dame of. She had this wonderful house, a farm actually, near Danbury, Connecticut, and it became a big meeting ground for raising funds for the NAACP, and just a kind of a salon, the way she had everybody wanted to spend time with Marian Anderson. And, you know, she was just the most elegant and eloquent, and just this, you know, the epitome of integrity,
Yeah.
and a kind of quiet courage that's just, I think, a great lesson, empowering lesson for all of us.
Now, with the time that we have left, does anybody have a question about, now, Dr. Arsenault has not seen the play, but he's pretty familiar with most of the things that are depicted in the play. But does anyone have a question or a comment about Marian Anderson?
Ladies and gentlemen, if you need a microphone, raise your hand. We have 2 floating around, but if you don't need
Someone
one,
in the back there, I think.
Go ahead, man.
Thank you so much for that. My mother was a great fan of Marian Anderson, and, you know, I've heard many stories. You need a mic? Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. My mother spoke often about Marian Anderson and Eleanor Roosevelt being her famous and important heroes. But I was interested, you did not see the play, but obviously you know the play. There's a lot of parallels of Einstein being that quiet hero for what was happening, not just to the nuclear bomb, but with what happening to his fellow Jews in Europe. And there's this wonderful part of Marian Anderson's history that the way she got to Europe to begin with to learn her lessons was through Rosenwald.
That's right.
Through local Jews helping her to get her. Could you tell more about that story, about how, you know, that support and the parallels between, because this happened all in the 30s and 40s.
That's a very good point. Of course, the Rosenwald Fund, Samuel Rosenwald was one of the heirs of the Sears Roebuck fortune, and he gave away an extraordinary percentage of his money to build schools and to fight pellagra and other diseases in the South, and there are Rosenwald schools everywhere. And these grants, when she got 2 of them, to go to Berlin, and that was really I think what really made it for her. She did 2 six-month tours there, and this was, of course, early enough. It was 1930, before the Nazis had taken power, and eventually she can't sing in Germany at all. But she's singing German lieder, and so she really needed to have the kind of access to the great German musicians. But that's certainly a important part of her story. And the parallel with Einstein, I'm not sure how the play develops it.
And he's going to see the play tonight, by the way.
Yeah, so I can tell you later, I hope. But I should say, first of all, that when I discovered the story about Marian Anderson and Einstein, I just loved it. It's probably my favorite page in the whole book. It's just one page, but I went to Princeton as an undergraduate, and I've stayed at the Nassau Inn just once. Too expensive for my taste, but and of course I knew a lot about the prejudice that she encountered in the South, and they tried very hard to sort of keep her out of the Deep South most of her career. But there was plenty of prejudice in the North as well, and I'm kind of ashamed, frankly, of Princeton for what happened. But and I've never gotten all the details of how Einstein knew that she was being turned away in 1937. I suspect. He was such a character; everybody knew him, and he was, his hair and all that, and world famous. Most famous scientist in the world, and so I suspect it was one of the. I've always thought it was probably one of the the bootblacks and the shoeshine, the African Americans working at the Nassau Inn that somehow got a message to Einstein, and he races over to save the day and to offer a room to her, and they just hit it off. And of course, he was an amateur violinist, and he loved music, and I think this was one of the great things in his life for the last 18 years of his life. Because after that first time, she came back every year, and she would stay with him till he died. In fact, she was there 2 months before he died in 1955, at his house, and he would call all of his friends in, and they'd do these musicals, and he'd play the violin. And I don't know how well he played the violin, but they just adored each other, you know. And so it's really I just love the story that he did that. I've always had great affection for Einstein. I think was an extraordinary kind of polymath, not just a great physicist, but a absolutely great human being.
Okay, and maybe one more question. Anybody have a question or comment? No? Well, let me end with this. I actually have a question, and I think you've written these books about Arthur Ashe and about the Freedom Riders, and you're doing one on John Lewis. Where does Marian Anderson fit in the pantheon of civil rights heroes? It was a brief point in time, and she doesn't have the body of work that some of the other people that you've written. But how would you describe where she fits and her importance?
Well, I would say if you look at the history of civil rights, we often distinguish between the charismatic leaders like Dr. King, the leaders, and the others that we call foot soldiers. And one of the big themes in writing and studying civil rights is to put a greater emphasis on the foot soldiers. Some of you may have seen the movie Selma, which I think was a good movie, but bad history. And they really changed many things in terms of what the reality was. But one of the things that that they forgot was the foot soldiers. And I think Marian Anderson is sort of both. You know, I mean, she didn't choose to be a civil rights leader, but she, in some ways, put her body on the line. Not in the way that people did in demonstrations in the South, but you know, she's a performer. She's out there, and you know, she knew that she was treated differently than others, that she had certain advantages, that because she was Marian Anderson, she didn't encounter as much prejudice. But that didn't stop her from devoting so much of her time to civil rights. And there was a couple of incidents. One, you know, Paul Robeson was demonized. They took away his passport because he had some connections to the Communist Party, and she was a friend of Paul Robeson's. I mean, she was not an agitator. She didn't agree with everything that he said, but when she finally did sing at Constitution Hall, she didn't let her do it in 1939, but in 1943 she did sing at a war bonds rally, and they had turned Paul Robeson away. They wouldn't let him do the war bonds rally, but he was trying to raise money for essentially the Chinese. The China lobby, and so she does do the concert, and she makes a big point at the end saying, and I'm going to give all the money to the China lobby. Everybody knew this was code, that she was telling the DAR that, you know, what you did to Paul Robeson was wrong. And later, in 1958, when during the Little Rock crisis, and Louis Armstrong is performing, I think it was in the Dakotas, in the Northwest, and maybe he had too much to drink that night, I don't know, but he went on a kind of screed where he starts attacking President Eisenhower, for not doing anything. Now, eventually Eisenhower did send in the paratroopers and effectively desegregated Central High School in Little Rock, but at that point he hadn't done anything. So Louis Armstrong, uncharacteristically, went sort of crazy. And there was all kinds of horrible press, and a lot of black leaders turned their back on Armstrong, at least temporarily. They did not back him up. But of all the people to back him up and to stand with him was Marian Anderson. And I think people were shocked because she was considered to be such a gentle soul, but she had this moral fiber, I mean, almost like a will of steel. And she was not going to let anybody tell her what to say or what to think. And I always think of that in some ways she's a role model. In some ways like Arthur Ashe, who obviously had a lot of involvement in civil rights, but you know, she broke down all the stereotypes. I think maybe that's the most important thing she did. But she went beyond that, I guess is what I'm saying. She could have stopped at that and just enjoyed her money and her life and her fame. But she felt a real sense of responsibility, I think, to the African American community, and she did a lot of wonderful things.
And the book is The Sound of Freedom, Marian Anderson, the Lincoln Memorial, and the Concert That Awakened America by Dr. Raymond Arsenault. And is it my understanding this is going to be possibly a movie or a film, or it's got some more legs?
Well, if we're lucky, there's a Hollywood movie. There's a Hollywood movie, not quite in production yet, and then the American Masters film, which will be out sometime next year on PBS, directed by Rita Coburn. So. Okay. All Marian Anderson all the time.
So I want to thank my guest, Dr. Raymond Arsenault. And I want to thank all of you for coming out and supporting Florida Studio Theater and supporting our Forums series. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.